Hi, Doug Goldstein here. You might have heard the interview I did a while back with David Kuenzi. He's an advisor like I am who specializes in cross-border investing. He's based in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm based in Israel, but we both help Americans and non-Americans who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. So what I wanted to do when I spoke with David today was to talk to him about the issues that people have opening U.S. brokerage accounts. Why is it I can't open a brokerage account or an IRA account or even a bank account just because I have an address outside the United States? There are a lot of companies that will absolutely refuse to open such an account. Some companies, in fact, are willing to open an account. It all goes back to 9/11 and to the Patriot Act, and also to the fact that people who were trying to sue the terrorists and get money from them, or sue the banks that were involved in moving money for terror, found that in order to sue these banks, they needed to sue them in New York because the United States had a lot of laws against terrorism, frankly. But in order to be able to sue a company in New York, you have to find that company has some legal presence in New York. And it turned out that there were some non-U.S. banks who were doing banking through correspondent banks in the United States. And just because of that little relationship, they might wire money through a bank, that was enough to bring these lawsuits into New York and literally lead to hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of claims against banks who had been involved in funding terror. That's just a little background. I think you're really going to enjoy the interview that I do with David Kuenzi, today's interview as well as the previous one, which you can check out on YouTube. Enjoy. Okay, I'm very excited to have back on the Goldstein on Geld show David Kuenzi, who is also a certified financial planner like I am, and he also specializes in cross-border investing, dealing with people who live outside the United States who have U.S. brokerage accounts or IRA accounts. David, I want to focus today on one of the issues that I think you and I probably look at every day, which is why is it so difficult for anyone who lives outside the United States, including Americans, to have or maintain U.S. investment accounts?
Hi, Doug. Great to be on your show again. And this is a great topic. We talk a lot about this. This has become a huge and quite honestly a painful issue for a lot of Americans abroad who are finding that their access to financial services, not only in the countries in which they live, but also in the United States now increasingly are being curtailed because of the problem of access because of regulation. So this story goes back probably a long way, and it has evolved over the last decade. It really started with the Patriot Act of 2001, which your listeners are probably familiar with. Of course, this was in response to 9/11, and the U.S. government really decided they need to ramp up the rules about cross-border transactions that they thought might be resulting in illicit funding of terrorism. And one of the consequences of that legislation were some rules that seemed to imply that U.S. financial institutions really had an extremely high barrier in terms of KYC, as it's know your client, established for them. And many of them took the opinion that actually having an account for someone who lives outside the United States, it's so difficult to verify their identity that you can't really meet that standard. And that started a wave of an evolution of a process whereby a lot of Americans started losing their financial services if they do not have a U.S. address.
Yeah, what I found was crazy about that also, just in sort of the fundamentals of it, was you were talking about Americans who had U.S. passports and have U.S. passports who for whatever reason, maybe they were assigned overseas or they chose to move overseas, and all of a sudden they get marked as someone who's a potential money launderer, which would be good compared to what else you could be marked as, like a terrorist or someone supporting that. It just seems to me as though the U.S. regulations swung so hard that it was damaging the wrong people because, hey, the bad guys can always, move money in euros, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, the people that the laws were intended to target probably did face some restrictions and inability to do what they were doing, but the unintended consequences, as so often in these cases, was a whole swath of people that were never intended to be restricted in any way, typical Americans abroad, whether they're in Israel or in Europe or in Asia. But they, of course, fell under these rules and were subject to really, really strict new guidance from the U.S. financial institutions that previously served them about whether or not they could continue to work with them. And it wasn't just the Patriot Act. It evolved over time. You had a really strict increase in other kinds of anti-money laundering rules in 2010, which led to another wave of U.S. institutions closing down Americans abroad's accounts. And then in just the last couple of years, there's been a whole nother new series of laws, this time from outside the United States, primarily in Europe, where you're seeing that the U.S. banks are not responding to U.S. regulations, but they're responding to new rules in Europe and in other countries where they have operations. And they're concerned that by having accounts for Americans who reside in those countries, they risk violating some securities rules in those countries, and they want to avoid that risk, especially for some of the bigger banks like Merrill Lynch or Morgan Stanley, who have big global operations and they have investment banking relationships in those countries, and they don't want to put those business lines at risk by having a few retail investment accounts opened for individual Americans residing in those countries.
Wow, it just gets worse and worse. We're talking with David Kuenzi, who is the founding partner of Thun Financial Advisors. He's based in Madison, Wisconsin, but David actually deals with people who live outside the United States. It was interesting for me to actually first touch base with him because he and I both specialize in that, but I do it from outside the US and he's in the US. But every day, David and I see the same sort of problems. One of the things I just want to stress is that people who are listening have to realize it is not illegal for someone who lives outside the United States to open a brokerage account. Do you get the feeling that people believe that they're just not allowed?
Yeah, well, that's a really common response we get from people. They'll say, well, I was told that I can't have an account. Well, the reality is there's absolutely nothing in the U.S. rules or any other country's rules that I know of that says people are not allowed to have accounts in the U.S. Really, what's happening is the banks are looking at the complexity of the compliance issues when they might choose to have clients who reside in another country, and they're simply saying, look, it's not worth it to us. We're going to have to create all this compliance infrastructure. We're going to have to do all this reporting. And so they choose to simply exclude Americans residing outside the United States from doing banking services here. Or in Europe, you see a lot of European institutions will reject Americans from opening accounts. And it's not because there's some law that says they have to do that. It's simply that these banks don't want to engage in the compliance that is now necessary whenever you provide any kind of financial services to American citizens.
Yeah, I think it's not only a business decision, which I would say it probably mostly is, but interestingly, if a client engages in money laundering and let's say really is a bad guy and comes to your office and you don't notice it, and it turns out he was a bad guy and he ends up in jail, the regulators are going to look back at not only you, but they're going to look at your superiors and the compliance officers and everyone who signed off on the wires that this bad guy was sending, and they could actually hold these people criminally liable. And all of a sudden, some compliance officer in New York is going to say, wait a second, I had no idea who this bad guy was. He can't look reasonable. He sent in a passport. So we okayed it. And all of a sudden, he's facing criminal charges. I fully understand why companies that are not set up for this would not want to be, sticking their toe in the water.
That's absolutely true. And if you look over the last, decade or so, the U.S. has issued hundreds of millions of dollars of fines against big, well-known banks for not sufficiently enforcing rules that, quite honestly, if you go back and look at it at the time, nobody was really doing, right? But in retrospect, something bad happened, and now you've got to explain what, in retrospect, looks like something you should have done that you didn't do. And yeah, you're right. People have huge fines have been levied. Some individuals have been prosecuted. And so the banks, not surprisingly, say, it's just not worth it to us to deal with these relatively small number of cross-border clients when we've got millions and millions of people in our own country. We don't have to deal with any of this.
Yeah. So, okay. So we can be sympathetic to the compliance officers and those big brokerage firms. But the fact is there are companies like yours and mine that do deal with people who live overseas. And the way we do it is we really focus on KYC, on know your client. We actually spend the extra time. And it's not that, no client comes into, an office like ours and just fills out a form and opens an account and starts trading. That they have to meet with an advisor or speak to an advisor and really, present who they are. A lot of people overseas also have, when they left, they may have had a 401k or maybe an IRA. Is there any issue that you've come up with that's stopping people overseas from having retirement accounts also?
A lot of our clients, as is the case with almost all Americans, acquire a lot of their assets in U.S. retirement accounts. And in general, it's not a problem. There are tax issues with these accounts with respect to the local taxation rules in various countries around the world. So you have to go on a country by country basis and analyze the tax implications of the distributions and things like whether or not a Roth IRA actually works from a tax perspective in that country. But from the point of view of simply maintaining that account, there's really no country of residence rules that ever create a problem for having these accounts. Where you do have problems again, though, is the U.S. institutions. The big 401k provider, for example, Fidelity, has in many, many countries around the world told owners of 401ks residing in those countries that their accounts are frozen. And so that's again a problem because they're reacting to their own regulatory environment. And the result is that people's savings in accounts that in many cases they can't even close because they're even contributing, they're working for these companies, they're effectively frozen and prevented them from moving to another institution where they might be able to manage the assets.
Yeah, that's crazy. We always try to help clients to at least roll their 401k into an IRA, but you're right, it's not always possible. Hey, David, I see we are just about out of time, but in the last few seconds, tell me, how can people follow you and follow your work?
Well, the best place to find out more about Thun Financial Advisors is to go to our website, www.thun, that's THUN, thunfinancial.com. And there you can learn all about our firm and a lot of the research that we publish on these cross-border issues.
Okay, we will put a link to that at the show notes of goldsteinongelt.com. David, thanks again for coming back.
Yeah, it's been great, Doug. Thanks so much for having us. We really enjoy this.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Check out all of Doug's money ideas at goldsteinongelt.com. Doug specializes in helping people who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. If you have a question that you would like answered on the air or off, contact Doug at his website or send him an email to doug@profile-financial.com.